All right, let's jump right into this one. Today we're exploring a practice that, for many of us, is completely normal, infant ear piercing. But we're going to look at it through the lens of one author's really challenging perspective, an argument that it's something much deeper and maybe, just maybe, a little more complicated than we think.
Right out of the gate, the author hits us with this really provocative claim. So, what on earth could they mean by indoctrination? I mean, that's a heavy word. To really get it, we have to break down the author's logic step by step.
So how can a simple pair of earrings possibly be considered indoctrination? Well, the author doesn't just throw that word around. They build a case by arguing that this one act sits at the crossroads of three very specific ideas.
Okay, here's how they connect the dots. They argue that infant ear piercing starts with a kind of guardian overreach, then it uses a symbolic mark for group identity, and ultimately it ends up shaping the child's behavior and how they understand their own body. Let's dig into that a little more.
The source actually gives us a name, symbolic branding. The idea here is that the earring isn't just an accessory. It acts as a visible token of belonging that's given way before a child can possibly understand or choose it for themselves. In this view, the identity is sort of embedded first, and personal understanding is just expected to follow along later on.
So what's the big deal? Well, for the author, this piercing has two really powerful consequences. First, it kind of normalizes the idea of enduring pain for the sake of beauty. And second, it sets a precedent, a sort of unconscious rule that says an adult's wishes can override a child's control over their own body.
And this, of course, brings us right to the ethical heart of the whole argument. And it all boils down to one really powerful word: consent.
This is a big question the author wants us to wrestle with. Every parent or guardian has to walk this line every single day, right? But the source argues that some acts cross that line much more clearly than others.
And here's the author's crucial distinction. Stewardship, they say, is all about protecting a child's future choices, defending their autonomy down the road. But control? That's when you start making irreversible cosmetic choices for them, essentially taking that future choice off the table.
Now here's a point the author really hammers home. There is absolutely zero medical necessity for this procedure. None. It is a purely cosmetic or cultural act with actual risks, where the decision is made by someone other than the person whose body is being changed.
Of course, there are many common and very deeply felt defenses for this practice. The author takes these head-on, so let's just run through them almost like a rapid-fire Q&A section.
Okay, first up, probably the one you hear the most. It's a tradition, right? It's just part of who we are. The response here is pretty blunt. Culture isn't a moral trump card. The point is that cultures aren't static. They're not set in stone. They argue that societies are always evolving by weighing old traditions against new values, like, say, the rising importance of individual consent.
All right, what about this one? The next argument is all about memory. The infant is so young, they won't even recall that moment of pain.
From this perspective, that completely misses the ethical point. The core issue isn't whether the person remembers the action, but whether they had the ability to choose it in the first place.
And then, of course, there's the argument from personal experience. You hear it all the time, right? Hey, I had my ears pierced as a baby and I turned out perfectly fine.
The author has a name for this: survivorship bias. Basically, we're only hearing from the survivors who are okay with it, but their positive outcome doesn't really settle the bigger structural ethical question about consent for everybody else.
Okay, so after all that critique, what's the alternative? Well, the author doesn't just tear the practice down. They propose a constructive solution, what they call a consent-based approach. So instead of this preemptive act, the source suggests all these ways you can actually build a child's understanding of their own body. Things like using temporary decorations like stickers or clip-ons, creating ceremonies around the choice when they're older, and even just simple everyday things like consistently modeling consent by asking before giving a hug.
This quote really just captures the entire philosophy of the alternative. For this author, love isn't about making choices for a child. It's about protecting their ability to make their own choices whenever they're ready.
And as we start to wrap this up, the author zooms out to make a much, much larger point. A point about how our fundamental values actually get formed in the first place.
This leads us to the final, and maybe the most common dismissal of this entire argument. You might be thinking it yourself. Is this just a huge overreaction to a tiny, common procedure?
Well, the author's answer is a powerful one. They argue that it's precisely in these small, seemingly low-stakes, everyday practices that our biggest and most important lessons about life, about our values, and about our own bodies quietly take root.
And here, the whole argument really comes full circle. The author contends that infant ear piercing acts like a form of indoctrination in miniature. It follows an unquestioned rule, it uses the earring as a body symbol, and, most critically, it completely removes the individual's voice from the decision.
And so we end with the author's final challenge to us. You see, this isn't just about earrings, it's about a core principle. If we truly want to raise kids who understand and value consent for their own bodies, then where and how early does that lesson really begin? It's a provocative question, and definitely one worth thinking about.